Hi everyone, Dan Gunner from Insane Forensics. Welcome back to Tech Talk Tuesday. Well, if you missed it last week, the White House released this statement on cybersecurity and how every company needs to harden in light of everything going on. And this is what we're going to focus on today. So to kind of sum it up, what's happening just with everything happening in the world is the White House is like, hey, we have intel that unfortunately we can't share that, there potentially could be a lot coming on in the upcoming weeks just with where the world's at. And so what they did is they put out this fact sheet. It's a pretty good fact sheet. The guidance, though, a lot of these controls, when you talk through them, unfortunately, they're going to take a while to test. They're going to take a while to get production and see results. And so what we're going to talk about is what you can do immediately. But to summarize what the White House put in their recommendation in this is things like mandate MFA. Well, as of the time we're making this, Okta was actually compromised this week. There's still not a whole lot of details going into that. So, some of these recommendations didn't age very well this week, just with what's going on. Other parts of it did, deploying modern security tools, deploying packages, backing up data out of reach, tabletops. Educate users. This is one you can do immediately, but again, changing user behavior isn't something that's going to happen immediately. So it is something you should start, but you're not going to see the results of that for a while. Checking for code and network phones, obviously great. When you get into the developer side, though, again, there's going to be a longer tail on doing this. And then we'll talk about working with CISA and FBI kind of later in some of our recommendations on this. But if you missed it this week, you probably honestly had a lot of sales calls. A lot of companies are, pushing their products, and they took the announcement this week basically and have thrown it into sales. So what we wanted to do today was talk about what you can do for free, right? So you're getting hit up probably a whole lot right now if you're any sort of decision maker on LinkedIn. You're getting hit up with sales pitches of like, hey, White House put this out. Here's this awesome paid option. Let's talk about what you can do for almost free, we say, because your time is valuable. And so that's where the almost is. But everything we recommend here are things you can do pretty much on your own for the most part. So what we're going to do is we're going to break this down into three sides. So prevention, detection, and response. If you're a NIST cybersecurity framework person, you're going to have to kind of overlay like prevention's kind of step one and step two in parts. Detections, obviously detect, in part maybe a protect, and then respond and recover on that. So, but let's talk about things you can do today and have impact today. Like we said, some of the recommendations White House made were good. They're just going to take longer. Let's also talk, like we said, things you can do on your own. Because there are a lot of vendors that are offering, free tools, free consulting, all that. The problem is there's a cost to onboarding tools. There's a cost to installing it, learning how to use it. If you're a big enterprise, there's costs on just purchasing the thing, getting it in the door and testing it. So again, we're going to focus on things that hopefully don't have as big of supply chain or purchasing or, complexity around it. And we're also going to focus on things that span both people, process, and technology, right? So security is not just about one area. You can't just buy technology to make the problem go away. You also have to consider, people and process side. And likewise, you can't just hire people and, expect them to kind of run without the right tools or process. So, let's hop right into it. So prevent approach one. Something you can do immediately today to strengthen cybersecurity is, updating that list of your business critical systems. And if you don't know what your business critical systems are, my critical system test and disclaimer, please really don't do this. We're not liable if you actually go do this. But if you turn the system off or unplug it, how quick do you think you're going to get an angry call to the help desk, right? Or to management? You might actually have operational data on this, right? So if you've had a network or service outage and users have lost access to something, and you really had a spike down in productivity, or you had a spike up on angry users that are saying, hey, I need this service to do my job. It's probably a critical system to how your business operates. Because at the end of the day, I mean, you have to ask your question, like, what systems and what parts of my network are really critical for business operations? This is something your operational folks might know a little better too. So, they might be the perfect people to ask for this. When we've done red team engagements in the past, actually some of the best attack scenarios we ended up going with came from not people in the technology groups, but actual operators, actual people in the business. When we were like, hey, you've been here 25 years, how would you bring this place down? They told us, we ended up coding and doing it, and it worked out well. Those type of people are incredibly helpful for knowing, hey, what are our actual critical systems on this? Execs also have their what keeps us up at night concerns, and they have a view. Obviously, they have a view both from, kind of being higher up in the organization, potentially also understanding, visibility between business units. But, definitely those are other groups that you can bring in to understand here. But really with this step and with this approach and this first thing you can do, you should leave understanding like what systems and networks really will stop my business and what's the impact there, right? And are those assumptions correct on criticality, right? So everyone's like, well, I think this server is critical. And, if you kind of keep asking them why, sometimes that criticality will fall apart and they'll say, well, I just think it is. It's like, well, sometimes you need to test that, right? And sometimes you need a little more verifiable data to say what's really critical at the end of the day. Also, another important thing, and this will really build as we go later through this, where are those critical systems? Who cares about them? And how do you actually access them? So equal to identifying them is also going to be, how do I actually make a change on those systems or respond? And are any of them internet connected? And Shodan can help for this. As I said, you should ignore editorial opinion for part of this approach. Some people are going to have opinions and say, hey, according to my risk metrics, it's going to be here. But what you need to do as you do this is really dig into that data and say, okay, well, we lost this service over here that people don't think is critical, and our operations got really bad and we lost a bunch of money off of it. Like, okay, that's, we have to put more criticality here, right? So for the Shodan approach, this is one example. I blued out the IP address and the host name there. But this is an example to where Shodan does actually show vulnerabilities. So down in that bottom left, you see CV 2019-11510, this Pulse Secure VPN. There's actually a few. I think there was an NSA report about this, about at least one nation state using it, if not two. I know there are at least two nation states where there's a bunch of reporting on using this, but this is on Verizon Business up in, I think in New Jersey or somewhere up in the Northeast or Mid-Atlantic. So even understanding like, hey, I have this VPN endpoint that's out on Shodan that's been seen that there's no nation state vulnerabilities for. I mean, this is something you should know about in your environment if you're tasked to protect this. And in this step, this will help you. Building off of approach one, once you know what is critical, start going through those and make sure that those actual safeguards are working the way you expect, right? Are the systems healthy? Are the networks healthy that are critical? What are the patch levels? What are the log configurations? What services are running on them? And do I actually need those services? What services do I need to be ready to respond in, right? With those services, you can go out and say, like, what logs do those services generate? And start to really dig into, okay, now I'm starting to understand what really is critical for my business's operation and what I'm going to do if someone does decide to go towards that criticality. But this also gives you the chance when you get into like syslog, sysmon to see, okay, what's my visibility on critical systems, right? This is also where the White House's vulnscan recommendation can be accomplished, right? This is something if you have Nessus or if you do vulnscans through other tools like Acuinetics or others, this is where vuln scanning fits in if you're using that White House report. Don't forget cloud assets. Don't forget other trusted assets, vendor managed assets. Anything you have a trust relationship for that your business relied on should be put here. The outcome here, right? So you're confirming safeguards. So if you find that shortfall in safeguards, patch what you can immediately without breaking your environment. So obviously if you have change control or depending on the strength of your enterprise, you want to go through that process. But really, right, if you're in that Shodan case to where you have a known vuln that at least 2 major nation states are using, you might say, hey, that's really a situation where we're going to, emergency patch this, or we're going to take a drastic action because the risk is high of this being used. People are using it out there, right? This also makes sure the configuration on devices is what you think it is. We frequently see in engagements to where, people don't really know 100% what their configuration is, just because as your network grows, you have a lot to be concerned about. So this step will verify some of those assumptions that you make there. And again, it's confirming you can actually access those critical systems when you need them, or figuring out what the process is and if you need to update or improve that process. But in step 2, what we're doing is hardening or doing a health checkup of those critical systems. In step 2, we talked a lot about the specific critical systems. Let's talk about trust boundaries, right? Trust exists everywhere, right? And that's where I really don't like the zero trust misnomer, because it's not zero trust. You're actually just moving trust into another network. And Okta this week, Okta this week is a great example, right? It's what's being reported out is that, and it was posted up to Twitter, I think screenshots, is someone was able to get into Okta, get basically root level on Okta, right? If you have that multi-level access and someone gets into it, it's just like having domain controller admin on a red team assessment, right? So zero trust makes it sound like trust disappears. Trust doesn't disappear, it's just shifting. And so in this step, that's where prevent approach 3, you need to understand what those trust boundaries are and harden them as needed, right? This is going to depend. If you're a traditional organization, mostly work on site, you might have a traditional boundary with, Palo Altos or, some other firewall brand on that. If you have that, then your defense is or your trust boundaries are going to be more traditional, if you would say, than if you're hybrid, right? If you're like, okay, well, a lot of people work from home, right? Your trust is more distributed in that case. What this changes is the segmentation, right? It changes it inside the organization. And what you need to consider here is, how is it configured? Is it configured properly? Is it actually going to protect me? And what do I need to do to improve it, right? Things like, hey, when did we actually look at our firewall rules, right? And also this week, or it might have been last, there was a FBI report that kicked out a bunch of IP addresses that were scanning or doing something to energy firms in the US, right? And those IP addresses were used, I think, against other nation state operations. But it raises that question of, okay, cool, we have these known IPs. Do we need these foreign net blocks hitting our VPN if you're an energy company, right? Or do you put a process in place to say, okay, if you're going on a Mediterranean cruise and you're going to go around a bunch of countries, are we going to have a way to validate to say, we won't allow most foreign IP blocks unless you actually ask for an exemption in there? Again, this is where you need to look at those trust relationships to say, hey, where can we harden? An outcome on this from the CISA critical infrastructure report. So from these White House reports, CISA also released one for critical infrastructure. They talk about things like verifying VLAN effectiveness, verifying firewall effectiveness, and again, verifying that trust relationship, but also the preventative techniques work the way that you should. You need to consider your business's entire scope of operation, both inside and outside the boundaries, right? So if you have other companies or you have partners that you have network trust relationships, open firewall rules, VPNs, you need to consider the level of access they have in, or at least document in this if you're not immediately going out for an action, you should at least understand like, hey, this is our relationship with their other vendor in case they get popped, so that, you know, we can not just assess and harden, but we can also do detection and understand why they're there. So the first three covered prevent. Now we're going to move into the detect side, right? So things you can immediately do to help your detection. Look at the quantity and quality of network data used, right? Where in the network are you tapping? Things like, hey, if you have those critical systems and networks, say, are our tap points actually looking at enough of those networks, right? And you can't just consider boundary, right? Because if you just tap the boundary, you're just going to see the traffic going in and out. You know, if an attacker is able to get one of those users inside to open up an email and they have, you know, a malleable backdoor from like something like Cobalt Strike has, or if they're just using something like TLS, you know, it might be tricky if you're just monitoring the boundary to see the evidence of that phishing campaign, right? You might need to have a monitoring point at a lower level where you're mirroring or spanning a port from a switch to where you're seeing more host-to-host traffic, right? That can really get into the quality. From the quantity side, you need to consider like, hey, also, you know, do I have a level of data that can I help? Do I have enough data to actually help as I go through threat hunts, IR reports, as I understand how I'm doing investigations? Do I have enough data to answer the questions that I need to answer? Does it match my detection and response needs? Ways to evaluate this: you can look through threat hunt reports, IR reports, MITRE ATT&CK. Those are good ways to kind of say, okay, well, we use data at this time, you know, this technique, or if we understand the malware, if there's other reports, you might say, well, we missed the opportunity to look for this data. Oh, we didn't collect this at all. And so kind of being critical of yourself and understanding where you're doing things well and not doing things well will help you out. What this also very much helps you with is understanding what people, process, and technology investments really benefit you, right? If you just keep buying security tools and they're overlapping, they're not going to help you, right? If everything's just configured to look at one part of your network and you're not like looking at the other ingress and egress points, or you're not looking low enough down to see certain techniques, it's not going to help you. So the outcome here is identifying detection strengths and weaknesses. It's identifying and prioritizing where you're going to improve next before someone tries to sell you something, right? Because there are a lot of really good salespeople that will convince you that your next step's a good step. But really in this is where you should do that fair and balanced. What is really going to help me at the end of the day? What's really, and last step, identify what really is going to make that decision. What you're doing here is trying to lower mean time to detection and mean time to response. And by having both that good quantity and quality of data, you know, you can hopefully push mean time to detection and mean time to response down. Once you have that data, so the other thing you should do is identify currently missed detection opportunities, right? So, you know, using those critical systems and networks, right? What are the capabilities on the existing endpoints and network devices, right? You know, what tools am I using? You know, and then after you know what those devices are actually using or what those devices are capable of, right? So oftentimes what we'll ask people we're working with is, hey, what are you using for network switches? What are you using for firewalls? What are you using on endpoints? And what we're trying to do is match our understanding of the products and technologies out there with what they're actually doing, right? Because we want the delta between, okay, this is what you're capable of versus this is where you're actually performing at. And we want to find that delta there. It raises that question, what is configured versus what can be configured? And then from there, you jump into, where can I index data? Do you have Splunk? Do you have Elastic? Do you have GravWell? Do you have any of the other SIEM or indexing tools? How are you then processing data? As you're going through this, you want to stay in the brainstorming phase. You don't want to shoot down ideas yet due to handling capacity. You want to stay down to earth, but you also want to stay open-minded at this. The outcome, this will help you identify what you have in your existing architecture. It'll also help you categorize the complexity of implementing misdetection opportunities. So the more data you do forward over the network, as an example, some of the complexity might be like, hey, well, we want to get this data forwarded. If the network link is already stressed, then you might actually have issues implementing that. You're going to have to update that network link in order to do it. So understanding the complexity of implementing those opportunities. And then step 3, hopefully you'll find as you're doing that, you'll say, hey, this device is actually capable of sending this data to my SIEM, of sending this data to where I'm doing analysis. And so it's something you can, immediately test and enable. This point here is you might be capable of way more than you think of without an additional investment or without buying more. And it actually might not be that hard to implement. So step 6 on this. So test effectiveness of your detection architecture, including your people and process. So again, detection is only as good as the efficiency, right? So when you look at how your detection is actually working, this is where you bring in things like mean time to detection and mean time to response for all of the components in the architecture. And like I said, not just the technology, but how your security program actually runs. But also with your architecture, we'll start there. So how quickly do alerts get through that detection architecture, right? So if you're using like some complicated SIEM and SOAR and, data is coming through and having to be correlated, how long is it before it actually gets to a user, before that user reviews it, before that user says, okay, this is good or bad, and then before you actually start acting on it, right? You need to kind of understand where those choke points, where those slowdown points are happening inside the network. This doesn't have to be complicated. So the example on the left shows the CrowdStrike Falcon test alert. So we use Falcon on a lot of our assets. To get Falcon to kick an alert is just a single command. And so how you might test this is just running that command and waiting to see, how quick it actually takes to get end to end through the SIEM, right? You can do this. I've seen people do this with like asset inventory, right? They'll stick like a Raspberry Pi on the network. They'll start a watch and they'll say, okay, how long does it take my asset inventory tool to see the Raspberry Pi that I just plugged into my network? What you're testing here is how quick and how efficient your process is. You might be surprised here how quick it is compared to how it was marketed to you, how quick it was. Here also, you can do red team engagements, right? So as a red team's doing an engagement, you can say, okay, how long did it take us to see what this red team was doing? I will say the red team approach does take longer, but this is where a red team would fit into doing this. The outcome here, again, identify the timeliness, reliability, and effectiveness of tools. So if you find out that an alert's not going, that's obviously a gap that you need to do. Reliability and timeliness, how often? So, this alert fires 10 out of 10 times versus 2 out of 10. If it's 2 out of 10, you might need other controls to put in there. And again, you need to evaluate not just how fast the technology can do it, but ultimately how fast your security program can react to it. Because when you're actually in an incident response scenario, that's what matters. So you should leave this step understanding what the actual performance of your detection architecture is and what the gaps are versus kind of what the advertised to you version is. So that was detection. We're going to jump to response now. So the first best thing you can do in response or fundamental is dust off the incident response plan or build one if you don't have one. So we still see a lot of groups today that they don't have an incident response plans, or if they do, they effectively don't because it's not actually a workable plan that they're going through. So if you don't have an incident response plan, create one, right? And I think there's a lot of SANs and other resources that can help go through that. But regardless of what you do, regardless of if you're creating a new one or you're updating your old one, you need to ask the question, does this incident response plan still match your business's operations? Does it match the, those critical systems that we saw first, right? Does it match groups that we work with? Does it match, if I use it, will it actually work in my environment, right? Are vendors and external resources also considered in your IR plan, right? If you have a bunch of cloud providers, well, does your IR plan consider how you're actually going to run investigations using, the third parties that you rely on? So it's really important to make sure that that incident response plan works with the realities of your business and works with the systems and data that you have on plan. It needs to be optimized with the detection architecture in your data sources, right? So that incident response plan should be really tight with that available data source so that you can go through that mean time to detection and mean time to response as quick as possible. And then finally, as you get through the plan, are people actually trained and ready to execute that plan if activated? You can have the best plan in the world. It can be the best theoretical plan, but if no one's actually gone through it and used it, it's going to take you a lot of time the first time, or people aren't going to follow it if it's broken. The other advantage of actually running through it is you can see where it does and doesn't work, and where it doesn't work, you can make fixes. So the outcome here should be having a solid incident response plan that matches both the operational and technical sides of your business. You need to train and tabletop that incident response plan. This was a White House recommendation early on in there. And then making sure that you're minimizing friction when that incident response plan is activated. Because again, a good practiced incident response plan will allow you to respond faster when you need it than if you're disorganized or you're making it up on the go. So response approach 8, get social. And, there's a line straight out of that CISA report, engage proactively with FBI and CISA. This is very well intentioned. And, outside of just FBI and CISA, you might have a vendor where you have a incident response retainer. But starting with FBI and CISA, you need to understand what you're going to get out of the relationship. You need to understand where they fit into that incident response plan. You need to understand the limitations, the gotchas, the SLAs. The FBI is incredibly hardworking. They have great special agents, but their job is not to be there holding your hand through incident response. And if, reading this report, if you think, well, I'll just call the FBI, I'll network with the FBI and call them when I need help. You need to remember that they're a law enforcement organization. They're busy as it is. They're busy just as every other law enforcement is. And so engaging proactively can help get you that relationship, but you need to kind of define that relationship early on. And areas to consider in that is that when you're working with the government, whether it be federal or state, it's an asymmetric sharing relationship. So with the government, 100%, they're not going to be able to share all the information with you. And so likely you're going to be sharing more than them. And there's a lot of reasons, right? The classification system exists for a reason. There's a lot of FBI privacy between, how they run cases and how they protect their investigations, to where, yes, they might share with you, but it's not always going to be in your favor. There's also privacy issues, right? You really need to define what your privacy boundaries are when you're working with external groups, especially the federal government. And you need to understand the legal ramifications of working with those groups. You need to work with your lawyer, because at the end of the day, you need to remember the FBI is a law enforcement organization. And while they are there to a certain point to help you, there's a lot of legal nuance to that that needs to be worked through before, you just being like, hey, help me out, FBI, I need help. So same with vendors, right? If you have an incident response retainer, all vendors have limited assets, right? And so you need to understand where you fall in their priorities, and then what happens if a lot of their retainers go active, right? What's going to be the process to deal with it? Everyone wants to be number one. Where do you actually fall in that line? And what level of care are they going to give you, right? If your organization requires quite a few responders, how many of their people, how much capacity are they actually going to allocate you to show up? Same thing with sharing relationships with the government. Data sharing can be a little different. With third-party vendors, it's going to be kind of the same deal. You need to understand what data you're going to share with them ahead of time. So outcome, understanding who you can rely on for how long and for what is going to be important. Because like I said, and again, this isn't to hate on the FBI. They're incredibly hardworking, but at the end of the day, you need to be realistic and understand they're law enforcement. They're not there to help you finish out your case at the end of the day. And there's a lot of information that they're going to know that they unfortunately cannot share with you. But even with vendors, right, it's understanding, where can you rely on them for what and how long during an incident, including your IR retainers. You need to evaluate the external group's ability to help. So again, like using the CISA example, right, like I truly believe CISA does want to help, but there are, probably millions more companies than there are to CISA employees. And so understanding that, yes, they genuinely probably want to help, but when you're actually dealing with an incident, they're going to have varying actual ability to help you, if at all. Establishing the external and internal sharing policies before the event. This is going to be critical. This is something you have to work with your legal department. This is something you have to work. This should be in your incident response plan. I know when we were at the Air Force CERT, this is something we did have in there. Because also there were things by law, notifications we had to make by law, and data we had to share. So it can protect you both from the things you have to share side and also the things you shouldn't share. But having having a pre-shared idea or pre-idea of what you can and can't share is really important. And then, to foot stomp it again, vet your relationships with law enforcement, with internal legal, because once you tell law enforcement something, you can't get it back, right? And so understanding how you're cooperating with law enforcement and where is incredibly important to your legal posture as a company. So cybersecurity and incident response is a team sport. However, what you need to do, one of the best ways you can prepare is understanding what your relationships are, what the bounds of those relationships are, and what the no-goes for those relationships are prior to the events. Finally, for response, practice. Practice does make permanent. And so if you pull open reporting on an intrusion and run a mock IR case using your environment, right? Think of this kind of as a tabletop or an exercise of, running through a scenario in your environment. Actually collect that host and network data to make sure the data is available and to be sure that you know how to get it. If you're using retainer hours with a vendor, or if you have a retainer with a vendor, consider using hours. And what this will do, this is both to help you learn how to work together, but it's also going to help you maybe see gaps in how you work with a vendor during an investigation. In this, you want to be critical of yourself. You want to identify those actionable strengths and weaknesses. And what this is going to do, developing this scenario is going to force you to learn new attack techniques, right? So if you're like, hey, I want to learn, like Havocs, right, which is an industrial, actually the indictments were just unsealed on Havocs. It was a nation state campaign against, it was done against manufacturing and some critical infrastructure, but you might take that reporting and say, okay, let me do a Havocs scenario and think through how I would respond to that, think through the data I would pull, actually try to pull the data and actually do the analysis. this practice is going to improve your incident response program. And also, likewise, working with external groups are going to make sure you're ready for game day. At the end of the day, the goal of this step is to improve that muscle memory and to provide that opportunity for self-evaluation before it matters. Last one, we can't leave a talk without talking about this: prevention, detection, and response. This covers all three. Threat hunting is not just about looking for APT groups and tactics. A good threat hunt will cover prevention, detection, and response, and help you understand more about yourself. It's my personal view. You're never too immature to start threat hunting. It does get easier with maturity. Your first threat hunts are going to be probably a little, cumbersome and awkward at first as you're learning to work through your environment if you're not very mature. But you'll get better and you'll really start to understand your environment in ways you didn't before. The outcome here also is you learn to look through your environment for signs of threats. You might find that sign of threat and actually kick into a response scenario, but also where the prevention side comes in is the identification of additional hardening or monitoring opportunities. So SANS white paper link, the threat hunt model that you see on the picture on the left, we wrote a whole SANS white paper on it. Definitely recommend checking it out. We have a few videos on the YouTube channel for that too, so check some of that out. So thanks a lot for joining in. Hopefully these 10 approaches are things you can immediately use today. We hope to see you next week. Thanks a lot.